Hello there and welcome to episode 85 of Right Where You're Sitting Now. We're covering a very American topic this episode, and I had to travel all the way to America and find a co-host suitable for this kind of discussion, and I had to drag him out of retirement from this genre of podcasting to join me in the co-host seat. Welcome to the show once again, Mr. Raymond Wiley. How are you doing, sir?
Very good, Ken. If we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance now, that would be good, because America is here. So we've come to rescue you again, Ken, just like in 44.
Here we go.
And what a great topic, William Cooper,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's who we were talking about this episode, the kind of one of the OGs of the conspiracy world. There were a few before him, but the first one to really kind of crystallize what it means, in my opinion, what it means to be a true conspiracy theorist. And someone that I've kind of wanted to do a show on for ages, but not really had the excuse to do one before. But whereas our guest today gave us that excuse. Well, I mean, he gave us that excuse a few years ago, but I couldn't get in contact with him. So, but luckily I've managed to get in contact with him. So today we're talking to the author of Pale Horse Rider, the biography of William Cooper, Mark Jacobson. And Mark's a very well established and, honest to goodness journalist who's covered the life of William Cooper excellently in his book, and it's a great book. I've read it twice now. Absolute page turner as far as I'm concerned, because it's not only is it harking back to kind of something I was interested in growing up, but it's also it really harks back to that era, and I find that era a kind of golden age for lots of different weird topics, but conspiracy was fun then. There was a funness to it, even though Cooper was kind of dealing with kind of dark subjects. There was still a funness to it. It was a subculture, and now obviously this has all changed, but we'll talk about this with Mark in the episode.
Yeah, I think we can recapture a little of that little magic today, especially with somebody like Mark. Man, this guy, one of the most worldly people that I think I've ever interviewed, and seen so much. I think we could have sat and talked with him just about New York City for an hour today.
Yeah. He's definitely, he knows that city well, like he says in the interview. But yeah, so let's cut over to that right now, and we'll speak to you afterwards. Hello, Mark Jacobson. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm wondering, could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Brief biography. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, the 25 words or less one, I can't get that really. Well, I'm a nice Jewish boy from Queens. I grew up there, went to public schools. Public schools in the U.S. are different than public schools in the U.K. I mean, that means actually as taxpayers, and you go there and you're with everybody, and I was born in 1948, which makes it exactly perfect to be a hippie, which I certainly was willing to go along with the flow there. And I graduated from University of California at Berkeley in 2004, which was only 34 years after my class, but I did graduate. And, so and I became a writer. I had several odd jobs. I was a porter at the Port Authority bus terminal in New York. If anybody's ever been there, they know what that means. I was a cab driver in New York City during the early 1970s, and then I started writing for a living because cab driving was like way too hard. And I worked for, I worked for the Village Voice, which is, you familiar with that pipe paper?
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of thing, that kind of counter, we're the people that tell you like what's really happening. I did that. I was a magazine writer for many years, which I, almost all the things that I was able to make a living at and put raise three kids and put them through college no longer exist. So, they just vanished over the past 20 years. So, so I was happy to get a large chunk of the so-called good about that, because it really was a great job. I mean, do whatever you want. They pay for your ticket if you wanted to go somewhere. Now you work just as hard, and some internet company gives you $200, and they want you to sign a contract that it says that they own your work, even the stuff you didn't do for them, in perpetuity, and then you go like, well, I ain't going to sign that. He says, you want your $200? You have to sign it. I said, keep your $200, blah, blah, blah. And so I stopped doing it. Any event. And then, I did a bunch of stuff, and I wrote a bunch of novels and some nonfiction books, including Pale Horse Rider, which came out in 2018, I think. But after that, I retired from that because it's just too much work. It's just too much work. I mean, at this stage of my life, I mean, I really can't afford to spend 3 or 4 years doing something. It's just not going to be available to me. So, it's okay. I'm not complaining about that, but it's been I've been a happy chappy, and it's been all right. I'm a New Yorker. I mean, I identify. If you ask me who I am, I'd say I'm a New Yorker first, American somewhere down the line. Sort of rootless cosmopolitan. What those people on the radio are all upset about, the rootless cosmopolitanism, I mean, that's me.
Brilliant.
So, So,
but you came on my radar originally. You wrote a book called American Gangster, which was like a collection of kind of New York crime stories, like real New York crime stories. And then obviously, I think the book, which came first, the book or the film? The film.
No, well, what happened was there's another collection of that comes out of a magazine piece that I wrote for New York Magazine, and I think maybe like 2000 or something like that. There's another collection that American Gangster book that you're talking about is a collection of different journalism articles. There's a previous one which was bigger, called The Teenage Hipster in the Modern World. Strange title, but that's what it was. It has a lot of more of those kind of magazine pieces, which is basically what I was doing. The American Gangster thing is it's not my title.
Right.
That's Brian Grazer's title. Or Stephen Zalian, who wrote the screenplay for that movie. I had I'd become aware of this guy, Frank Lucas, who's the main character in the film, because everybody kind of like me knew that there was some drug dealer who had, either actually had done it or apocryphally had done it, had stuffed heroin in the body cavities of the dead American soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War. Now, this is quite a concept if you begin to start thinking about it. Like, this is sort of like the beginning of the end for the U.S. as like, the good guys. And, we managed to edit things out, like dropping atom bombs on people and killing 100,000 people in like 1 minute. That's not part of the narrative. But by the time of the Vietnam War, it becomes a different kind of situation. And somebody was actually packaging this death in the bodies of the dead soldiers, most of whom were black to begin with. It's just a very pungent kind of thing. So I never really believed it actually existed. Just was a kind of a story, or urban legend or something like that. And then this guy told me that the guy actually was alive. I mean, that it really was true on some level, and the guy was still alive, and that if he wanted to tell his story. So I found out where he lived, which was in a project in Newark, New Jersey, which is a really beat up area. And I knocked on his door, and he comes out and he says, "What do you want?" So, he'd been waiting all his life, for a guy like me to come knock on his door so he could tell me his story that he'd been working on, for a long time, because so in any event, I wrote this article about this guy, Frank Lucas, and basically, all the things that he had done as a major heroin trafficker in Harlem in the 1970s. All that stuff was in the cultural buzz because, everybody had seen Superfly and all that kind of stuff like that, and, Cotton Comes to Harlem, Shaft, all those kind of like black movies from the 1970s. And here was the real guy, and he was ready to tell his story. And, and Frank was a real character, to say the least. I mean, a con man to the max, and really not very attached. I mean, he knew everything. Because he really was the real guy, but a lot of the stuff that he said he did was not exactly 100% true, which was kind of a given. So if you actually read the original article, you'll see I'm writing, so Frank claims, there's a lot of that. So in any event, it got picked up in the, after, a lot of back and forth, Hollywood kind of back and forth kind of stuff. They made that movie called American Gangster out of that magazine article. It's one of the few times that a major Hollywood film had made out of a magazine article. I mean, before that, the only one I could think of really that is the same way is Saturday Night Fever, which was came out of the same magazine, was written by Nick Cohn, who I guess maybe you might be familiar with him being a Brit. So Nick wrote this thing called I don't really sure that Nick actually ever went to those nightclubs that he wrote about, them John Travolta dancing around there, but so it was like in that mode. And another thing that people might know me for is that when I was a cab driver, when I first started becoming a magazine writer, I was still a cab driver because I wasn't making enough money. So my boss at the time, a guy named Clay Felker, who started New York Magazine, was really kind of a big figure in magazine journalism. In fact, the Berkeley Journalism magazine thing was named after him. He said, "You're a cab driver? What are you doing here?" Because, I mean, he had all these kind of Harvard people working for him. The idea that somebody, who's actually currently driving a taxi cab was also appearing in his pages was sort of so astounding to him that he asked me to write an article about what it was like to be a cab driver, which I really didn't want to do. But since he ordered me to do it, I did it. And it became this TV show called Taxi, which was on TV forever, so, and I made a fair amount of money out of that. So I was glad to have done that in retrospect.
Yeah.
So, basically just, I've always lived in New York, except for a couple of years off of good behavior, living in California. And I live in Brooklyn right now, where it's 100 degrees.
Yeah, it's hot here today as well, weirdly, but which is rare for England, I can say. So I'm going to go back to 1994. I'm sat in my college, which is not what you consider college. The middle bit between university and school for us is called college. And the trend then was to log on to services like AOL and CompuServe and things, and you dial in. I always remember one day I got a document. I found a document on this list of documents there, and it said like government cover up of UFOs revealed, and it was this long document written by someone called William Cooper, and it was my first exposure to proper, true conspiracy culture. So I've always had this kind of not romantic, but like I've always sort of followed what William Cooper has done, and I've always read about him. He's always been a fascinating character. William Cooper and Art Bell, two legends in my opinion. But
William Cooper, he's unique.
Yeah.
I mean, the book didn't sell. And, a lot of my liberal friends refused to read it because they thought it was a pro-Trump book, because it's so stupid. I mean, there's no reason to think that the so-called elites of the East are any brighter than the morons of the West. So, it's like, I still don't regret doing it. I mean, it was a lot of work, but he's just he's a brilliant figure, man. I mean, brilliant in the sense of, I don't know. I mean, the way you guys use the word brilliant, I wouldn't necessarily, but he was a singular figure, to say the least.
So how did you, there's an interesting kind of tale behind how you discovered William Cooper. You kind of kept bumping into him, didn't you? Not him physically, but his work.
Well, you start off with, and we can talk about it at length, but it may not be that interesting to the audience. But I mean, the idea of so-called conspiracy or alternative thinking or alternative history, alt history. I mean, some people call it parapolitics. Different other, looking at the conventional narrative that they're putting out in the newspaper. Because when I was growing up, I mean, there was nobody. I mean, they would give us this kind of like basically a propaganda rag called My Weekly Reader. And we'd read about it, and we'd find out about how wonderful Warner von Braun was, because he was going to send America, he was going to keep America like in the space race, against those nasty Russians and stuff like that. And, we didn't know he was a Nazi. That was news to me when I found it. I thought that he was a wonderful guy. I look at the stars and all kinds of stuff like that. So, it became somewhere along the line, and let's say in the middle 1960s with the Vietnam War, of course. That's the fulcrumatic moment. And you begin to question some of this stuff. And most of this kind of questioning was coming from the left, the so-called left. All the Kennedy stuff comes out of people like Paul Krasner, and who was the editor of a magazine called The Realist, which is worth looking up if you want to, study this period. And, the idea that, the Warren Report was considered to be the first real major, piece of government mandated propaganda. I mean, if you read the Declaration of Independence, like when we got our independence from you fuckers, I just happened to read it yesterday or 2 days ago because they published it in the New York Times because it was 4th of July, right? And it says right in there that one of the major bitches the American colonists had against the British crown, right, was that they were conveying with the savage red Indians to take land from white people. Oh. Read it. It's right there. So, I mean, I go this is nothing new here. I mean, so, yeah, but that's
Proclamation of 1763.
Anyhow, I didn't want to cut you off there, Raymond, if you were going to say something.
I was just adding on. That was Proclamation of 1763. That's right. American settlers couldn't go across the Appalachian Mountains, and that was one of the big things.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at these documents, with an eye to picking out the parts that they left out of what they told you in school, you'll find a lot of stuff. I mean, on the other hand, there are a lot of admirable things, but you understand that as long as everybody is a white person, everything is very high-minded. Everything is fair. It seems very, as long as, but there's only certain kinds of people that applies to. The others, are just not part of the deal. And, they're not even considered to be somebody who could read this document. So, I don't mean to be too commie about it, but, it's fair, so it's hard to ignore. But anyhow, so William Cooper, it's this is kind of a long way of saying Cooper comes out of this tradition of the Kennedy assassination, what they call an assassinationology kind of thing, where people would read these things, and there were any number of books. There's a guy named Mark Lane wrote a book called Rush to Judgment, and that was really the beginning of this thing. And then on the right, they had this thing called the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society, if you read the John Birch Society stuff and edit out the more crazy stuff, like Dwight D. Eisenhower was an agent of the Communist Party. It's a little hard to figure that one out. But I mean, they really thought this. I mean, you're looking at the current Republican Party platform. I mean, it's very similar. So you've got this kind of distrust with the government coming from the left because J. Edgar Hoover was the boss, and he's the one that's running the COINTELPRO and all that kind of stuff, and sending his agents in to kill Eldridge Cleaver and all our heroes, of the Black Panthers, and stuff like that. So you got that, and then you throw in this kind of Birch Society outsider theory, which is, comes out of that libertarian idea, and you merge them together, and then eventually you're coming to create somebody like William Cooper, who is radicalized in this when he, you can read the book. It's a big, long story. But anyhow, and when he comes back from Vietnam, which was like his goal in his life, he comes from a military family, and he just wants to get out there and do what, to defend the Constitution by putting down the North Vietnamese. This is I never really quite understood that. But so then you come up with somebody like that, and William Cooper is not a right-wing guy at all. He's listening to these jazz records. He's a beatnik. I mean, he is a beat. He's got. I mean, you listen to his shows, which are all available. I mean, he says he's lambasting his listeners, who he knows are a bunch of fat ass, kind of provincial types, and telling him that you don't have anything compared to Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong is a great man. You are just a pissant. I mean, if you listen to it, you can hear all these kind of weird counter narratives. So I found this to be exceedingly interesting. Coming from where I was coming from, and the thing that actually got me, one of the things that really was the Zapruder film. Are you familiar with the Zapruder film? All right. So the Zapruder film is a major document of conspiracy thinking because it's the only visual record of the death of John Kennedy. And you can look it up and get all the details. But for a long time, one of the things that's been taken out of the narrative about the Zapruder film is that Time magazine, Time Life, the Time Life company, which was run by Henry R. Luce, who was the guy that came up with the March of Times newsreels that we used to watch when we were kids. You go to the movies and they always play March of Time. And it was basically Cold War propaganda for the most part. Not was thrown in with some real stuff. And in his number one guy was a guy named C.D. Jackson, another person worth looking up. And C.D. Jackson shows up and he takes a 50-year option, more or less, the way that somebody might option your magazine piece or something like that. 50-year option on the Zapruder film. And he also takes a 50-year option on the story of Marina Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's wife, who was a Russian, and they basically sat on a thing and you never could see it. It became this mythic object. If you're familiar with the work of Don DeLillo, he's a major American author of the period of time, still around, I guess, but his major work was in this conspiracy stuff because he has books where people are searching for snippets of footage and, they're desperate to get their hands on these things, like Adolf Hitler's porno film or something like that. So it was very hard to see the Zapruder film. So Bill Cooper, who's after he gets out of the Vietnam War, he's just really got this nasty case of PTSD. I mean, he's not all right, and he's a Navy diver, and he's got all kinds of strange jobs, and he teaches at these bogus universities, like Trump University, that kind of stuff, and so he gets a hold of the Zapruder film, and he comes up with this fantastic theory, which was not really his, that the driver of the car is the person who shot the president. And it's right there. You know, you can see it on the film because, and actually, if you get messed up enough, smoke enough blunts, and keep watching it, and you know, you begin to see it. Things are like that, you know. So, because as the guy turns around because he hears something, there's a flash of light off the head of the guy sitting in the passenger seat who has like bro cream kind of slick back hair, and that's really what the light is. But it looks like there's something in the guy's hand. So Cooper comes up with this great theory, and a lot of people go for it. You know, I mean, it's a fantastic idea that the crime of the century is committed in plain sight, yet somehow nobody sees. So that's a basic construct of conspiracy. You know, no doubt.
That one,
like,
you know, that one hasn't aged particularly well, but it's a great window into Bill Cooper, because if you're watching that and then you hear Bill Cooper describe the driver's got the dart gun and all this, he really can put you in that world. For me, I'm interested in him because he's a pretty famous broadcaster. That's just
he's a genius on the radio. I mean, who's better? If you listen to those things when he's on, he's not always on, you know, because he's fucking plowed half the time. But when he's cooking, hard to beat him. Hard to beat. He's got this kind of American, you know, I know what I'm talking about. I'm a reasonable person, but there's a place where I'm going to draw the line. And, you know, this is what I believe in. And I don't know what, you know, who knows what he really believed in. But, I mean, he was the best at playing that character. Really great. And then, of course, he was able to recreate that character into real life by managing to get shot out front of his house. You know?
Right. He kind of manifests himself into existence like many artists and celebrities do, I feel like. And that must have started in 1991 when he published Behold a Pale Horse.
Well, 1991 is a really kind of spectacular year in the history of the modern world. I mean, that's the fall of the Soviet Union. That is a moment at which the existing narratives since 1945 begin to shift. You know, like, so therefore, you know, everything that we used to believe is no longer true. So at that point, it seems like everything's up for grabs. And when that's one of the great things about Cooper and why I wanted to write a book about him. I mean, I could have written a magazine piece, and in retrospect, I wish I did. but you know, regardless. I
think you're really onto something there, though, because his theories, his ideas just thrived in that world between the fall of the Soviet Union and 9/11. And like you said, everything is up for grabs, and there's this weird left-right convergence in this sort of paranoid thinking in the conspiracy world.
In the 1990s, that whole period, and the thing that the business about the Cooper and the World Trade Center with his supposed prediction, which is actually, you know, I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to jump around, but I mean, it's a big topic, so I don't know how long you want to talk about it.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Bill Cooper he said, and you can look it up, I mean, you can listen to it yourself. He says something big is going to happen in this country, and and they're going to blame it on Osama bin Laden. He doesn't say what's going to happen. He doesn't say that the World Trade Center is going to be blown up, but he does say what I just said. And that is nobody else ever said that. So, he deserves credit for that.
There are people like in the FBI saying that in the years, like John O'Neill or whatever, but you would have never heard of just a broadcaster say that. That's way beyond.
Killed during that day, right? So, so that's just like, what more do you want? John O'Neill's the only other person that was like, and they were trying to shut him up too. So then he happens to die and on that very day, so like, along with all that stuff, all those paper records from the stock exchange, that they never somehow digitalized, and somehow, how many people saved money on that day? They didn't have to pay out of debt.
I think what's interesting is that Alex Jones and people like David Icke and these kind of upcoming conspiracy theorists at the time all claimed afterwards that they also predicted 9/11. But if you actually look at their timeline, it's clearly Cooper. It's Cooper, and you can see that.
I think the date is June 28th, 2001. I'm not 100% sure that's the date, but it's sometime in June. And he says it, and it happened. He says it before it happened. He's not going around saying, "Oh yeah, I knew that."
Yeah.
And
he's probably the only one in the group Ken, that's well read enough to have been aware of the USS Cole and what had happened in the embassy bombings in Kenya. Was it Kenya? Somewhere in Africa.
The newspaper. He was a regular kind of person who was like, he was not a transitional kind of internet person. The thing that one of the more interesting long-range things about Bill Cooper is he exists before the internet. So therefore, he's a different kind of person, saying this kind of stuff. And the fact that he's on shortwave radio and maybe has an audience of like 200 people. And half the time he doesn't even come in, that is like, that's mythic. That's the kind of right brain kind of stuff that becomes, you got to actually care about that to get into that kind of thing.
Yeah. You got to really want it.
But it reached even here.
I think for some of our younger listeners too, I think they would be interested in that. What does it look like to be a sort of indie conspiracy theory celebrity in the time of where everything's sort of analog? There is a little bit of internet at the time, but how does a person like that make money? Who do they perform for? Where do they perform?
He was always desperate for money. He was like poor, but he was determined. The thing about Cooper was it was all about the radio, and he, as strangely enough, oddly enough, even though I would say he was a pre-internet person, he did get his start in his UFO days on the internet when they used to have those bulletin boards with like. For younger people might not remember this kind of stuff, but it was this endlessly long thing of type. You'd go in and you'd open up your computer, and then it'd be this kind of thing, and it was the actual epitome of too long, didn't read, that kind of thing. But people would do it, because they weren't weaned off the idea that if it's more than a paragraph long, it can't be right. You don't want to pay attention to it. So like. In any event, so like, when he came out and it's like almost like, I would say he was a natural genius at this stuff. He was a genius. He knew immediately that the UFO thing was the way in. That was the only thing that people actually paid attention to. That was across the board. The UFO thing is the first major conspiracy theory of the modern world. The first time that everybody, almost everybody believes in these things, whether they believe in it or not, they believe it. And the government is telling you it's not true. That is it. There you are. And it doesn't make a difference who you are or what class you're from or what race you're a member of or any of these things. The UFO thing is across the board, and Cooper knows that. So he comes up with the most spectacular sighting I think I've ever read. this business about this. First of all, he's a Navy guy, he's got this credibility of the military imprimatur. And then this gigantic object comes out of the sky. It lands in the ocean, goes under the ocean, comes back out from crashing out of the waves, goes back up into the clouds, does it again 3 or 4 times, like it's showing off like what it can do, like, you puny humans, check this out, dude. And after that, I mean, it was most of the UFO people were like, they were beaten. I mean, this is like, if you know about UFO history, going back to Kenneth Arnold and all those people like that. Do you know who Kenneth Arnold is? He's the first sighting. He makes the first famous sighting, 1947, of this, and he's actually the guy who invented the word flying saucer, because he said that they looked like saucers skipping across the air, and then he got hooked up with a guy named Raymond Palmer, who is another great figure of for further research, who was an editor of a magazine called Fate magazine, who told he gets Arnold's story and writes the history of, that's really the beginning of the UFO thing right there. And, so Cooper grew up reading these things. He's one of these readers of that kind of pulpy stuff and comic books and stuff like that. It's all, I mean, I don't know what it was like in England, but this is a big deal in America, reading those kind of like, there were, for mystery fans, there were the Alfred Hitchcock things, Alfred Hitchcock magazine, Ellery Clean, and so when you first learned how to read, when you're 11 years old, these are the first things that you're actually reading on your own. You're not reading your school books, to do that.
Right. So while you're doing the book, how much of this information about Cooper before 1988 were you able to verify? Because he tells a lot of stories about himself.
It's not easy to verify. I mean, I did my journalist thing. I'm fairly. I mean, I had a lot of experience. I have a lot of experience doing that, and I'm not the greatest, but I can do it. And a lot of this. I mean, there's all kinds of records about, like, the stories that he told about his military experience. I mean, all the visits to the VA for PTSD related stuff. They didn't even know what PTSD was at the time, but he was an inpatient on at least 2 occasions. And that stuff's not in the stuff he was telling the people on the radio, but it's there. You can find it, but I found that to be okay. I mean, if you're trying to sell yourself as a kind of, sentient individual who's like looking at this with a clear eye, you can't have this kind of stuff on your record. So I figured that's okay. Cut that out. But and see, the thing that when he gets on shortwave radio, he was on this thing called, I can't remember the name of the station, but it was the largest single, had the most power of shortwave radio. It was called WWCR. It used to be Worldwide Country Radio. And then it got bought by somebody else and it became Worldwide Christian Radio, WWCR. So now you're moving into a more mythic and kind of like, you're making the move into the evangelical world where you've got all those people who are just not going to buy the tenets of the modern world, and you're dealing with that still now. I mean, that's what Donald Trump really got most of his support from. I mean, these people who like believe that that all that stuff. The reason why Trump could get elected, even though they had all that stuff of him doing all these unchristian things, is because he's God's, he's going to be a raised up broken vessel, and all this biblical stuff. But so Cooper recognizes that right away, that this is his natural audience, because they're not reading Scientific American. They're reading the Bible. So like, now you're And it takes him a long time to realize, you can actually watch his brain working if you're paying enough attention to this stuff by doing the actual research on him. And he's now, and then by the time he gets thrown off the air because he's an impossible person to deal with, and he gets in fights with every single person. And then he goes into his itinerant phase. He becomes sort of like, who Charlie Patton is? Blues guy. Charlie Patton was a famous blues guy. And they would like kind of an itinerant singer, or like it was like before newspapers, they would have people like a herald who would go around and, tell. So Cooper became this kind of like independent voice on shortwave radio, which, number one, most people didn't have a shortwave radio. You had to have a shortwave radio to be able to hear this. So already now it's exclusive. The exclusivity of the voice, of the manner, and the more difficult it is to find out the information, the more true it seems. I think that's really, that's pretty much a standard, idea of the way people get to these things. Like, you got to accept Jesus Christ to know what he means. You got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do this. I mean, I'm not knocking any of this stuff, don't get me wrong. But, you have to go through a certain degree of trial and tribulation. Like the Buddha, he doesn't just sit down underneath the tree, and suddenly become enlightened. He's got to walk around for many years, and it's just something you got to do. So to be able to get the truth, with the quotation marks on it, if you want, from a person, somebody like Bill Cooper, you got to go out of your way to find it. You can't just look it up on the internet the way people do now. That's one of the reasons why this whole stream of thought has become so devalued and kind of commonplace and stupid, basically.
It's mad how, with William Cooper, like how, I mean, in the 90s, there used to be a stall in London in a place called Camden. In Camden Market, it was quite well known. You could pick up kind of, illicit things there. But there was a guy that used to have a stall, and he'd sell things like bootleg recordings of, like live concerts and stuff. But he'd also sell, he had one stack of Art Bell Coast to Coast AM cassettes and one stack of Hour of the Time. I remember and you'd buy a stack of them for about £5. I remember because I was quite young, I used to save up money and go, because that was quite a lot of money then. But I'd buy this whole stack of William Cooper and Art Bell stuff. And it's mad that someone on a shortwave radio broadcasting to a few hundred people manages to become quite a cult figure over here as well. And you can say the same about Art Bell. Obviously we couldn't, it's before Art Bell started streaming online,
right.
But he had quite a big following here.
The more difficult stuff is to find, the more valuable it is. I mean, that's a standard fact of life, so, gold.
Ken, were you watching X-Files at the time? Because going through Cooper's theories, man, I feel like Chris Carter just lifted a lot of the conspiracy concepts in X-Files straight from Cooper's work.
Oh, yeah.
I interviewed Chris Carter, and he basically admitted that to me. I called him up, and he was willing to talk to me because he had some product out at the time, and I was working for New York Magazine.
We interviewed Dean Hagland on this show, who was the guy, the blonde hair, long blonde. He looks a bit like one of the Wayne's World, Garth from Wayne's World, but he was in the X-Files. He was one of the three horsemen, I think they were called.
The Lone Gunman.
Lone Gunman, that's it, Lone Gunman, yeah. And
Lone Gunman, yeah.
Yeah, and he said that.
But there's you can find this interview with Cooper with Chris Carter in Rolling Stone where he says, "I love those books, one with the big capital letters," which is definitely the Pale Horse for sure, right? So I called him up and he said, that was a big deal for me, man, because he didn't care. He was just looking for material.
One thing that's interesting as well is that Alex Jones kind of followed that same model, didn't he? Where he kind of got onto like one radio network and then sort of his tentacles kind of went out. But I guess he had he managed to rein it in enough to kind of, stay on these radio. I think he's still on quite a few of them, isn't he?
It was an evangelical network too.
Yeah.
It was Genesis Communications.
Yeah, it's that's pretty standard. I mean, Alex Jones, it's in the book, but he just went to school on Bill Cooper. He would listen to him at night and learn how to do it. And then they had all kinds of fights, because that's the kind of thing that sells in that kind of market. Everybody hates everybody else, like the rap. It's like rappers, well, fuck you. So one thing I will say for Alex Jones, who I think is really not a really admirable figure, but
agreed.
If you listen to his broadcast, which I write about in the book, he's the only person that understands that Bill Cooper dying the way he died, getting shot in front of his own house, is a big moment. He understands that. And he's on the radio talking to this guy, Glenn Jacobs, who lived right next door to Cooper, or could see his. I talked to him for that book, and stood out on his porch where you could see Bill Cooper's house from his porch. So they were friends, of course. And Jones is there trying to get Glenn to admit that he saw all these federal troops there, and they're the ones that killed Cooper. And this guy Glenn is going, no, that's not what But nevertheless,
sorry, man, it was just the county sheriff. Sorry to disappoint you, but
well, no, it didn't matter because Alex Jones is not going to go with the complicated and weird story of what actually really happened, So he's going to go with the one that's going to work for him. And
can we dig into the Cooper's death a little more?
Let's actually come back to that a bit later, because there's one thing I really want to talk about, which is the Mystery Babylon, which is this kind of big kind of his masterpiece in a way, isn't it? It's kind of it sort of set the tone. Yeah.
Some people feel that way. I got to say that some of Mystery Babylon gives me a big headache, but
yeah.
But I will say that the very first episode of Mystery Babylon, the one where he uses the stuff in the Kubrick film 2001 to start his investigation into the history of the world, is a true masterpiece of radio, just talk radio. It's just great. And I'm a big fan of that movie, So, and the idea that he would understand that the monolith was exactly the same thing as the tree of knowledge, that's forbidden fruit and all that kind of stuff like that. And that the first thing that the apes do when they become enlightened is kill each other. That is, he was on that in a way that, there are plenty of really smart individuals from Yale University and stuff like that who are writing treatises about that film, about what it was supposed to be about. And none of them get it like Bill Cooper did. He was just, it was like light years ahead of anybody else. For import of like what it might mean in the culture to people, normal people just sitting there watching the film. He divorced that intellectuality, that kind of like, and that Arthur C. Clarke stuff. He just got that out of there, and he told you what it meant to him. And one of the things about Bill Cooper, which is one of the great things about him, he's an everyman. He really feels that this is the way I feel. This is the way people like me feel. And those are the only people I care about. So, he just was brilliant. He had his hits and misses, but that was definitely a hit. The rest of the stuff, he mostly cribbed it from a book. So he ran, that was his great inspiration, and he tried to keep it going, but, I would say it was, it got less interesting as it went along, but it provided a kind of situation where it seemed like he was a great scholar, which is very important. He's a scholar of this material. Like Bill Cooper has done his research, and that's, see, for instance, it's interesting about Bill Cooper. We were having a big discussion about this only yesterday, right? And we're trying to follow the derivation of the word woke. which is a big deal in American politics right now. I don't know if you're familiar with this. You know, Raymond, right? This guy, Ron DeSantos, and all the kind of people that are counterintuitively trying to run to the right of Donald Trump are, attaching a lot of negative stuff to the word woke. In other words, but if you ask people, like, what does that mean? They're kind of at extremes to tell you what it means, because, it means a lot of kind of like unfortunate things, I think, so that people don't want to.
It's become this
about.
Sort of catch-all term for,
it's a catch-all term, but
I guess. It doesn't really make
much
sense to me.
We want things to go back to the way they were, is what it means, basically. So, but Cooper, he didn't invent the word sheeple, but he's the popularizer of that word. He didn't invent the word woke, but he's the person that keeps on saying "wake up, sheeple," and he uses the word woke throughout those broadcasts. And woke, the thing that's kind of fascinating to me about Cooper, which is really the main reason I wrote the book, and one of the main reasons I wrote the book was like his crossover to the hip hop community is just astounding to me as a cultural, the frisson of that kind of thing, where certain groups, like, why are black guys from the projects in Queens listening to what a fat white guy living on top of a mountain in Arizona, why do they care about what he thinks? Why do they think that is the main, that's going to give them some information? I mean, I talked to Prodigy, who was the main writer of Mobb Deep, familiar with them? I mean, they're, I said, is it true that you read Behold the Pale Horse 4 times, like you said in this interview? He said, no, man, that's not right. I read it 6 times. He said, I didn't want to go up there and start spitting, which is what a rapper does, unless I had everything right and correct. And right and correct is that's what if you know about this kind of shit, you understand that's from the vocabulary of the 5%er movement, which every single major rapper from the 1990s was a member of, I think. I mean, Wu-Tang, everyone. Busta Rhymes, they're all 5%ers, and you can go back and look and find out what that means. But that when they saw Bill Cooper and he's saying this kind of stuff, and that's what made that book the most popular book, among the most read books in the New York State prison system. These were the people who understood what this guy, who was outside society and had this kind of global complaint, they understood that in a kind of meaningful way. So, and it's true today. I mean, you can go 125th Street this minute. There are these guys up there with these tables selling books, and if you want to get a copy of Behold the Pale Horse, that's the place to go. So,
they buy up copies, don't they?
Like, what?
They buy up like bulk copies as well, don't they?
Well, I mean, recently, and I got to say, I've been remiss in finding that there seems to be a reprint of that book, which has deleted the chapter which has the entire text of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was considered to be a little too controversial even for William Cooper,
Yeah, he's one of the people.
He stumbled right into that one.
Yeah. He's kind of one of the things he's most known for. I mean, was kind of really. I mean, him and John Birch Society really pushed that document, didn't they? I mean, the protocols.
No, he's much more enlightened than they are. I mean, actually, I'd be interested to find out how these things play in the UK, because I only know about the American context of it.
Well, I know he didn't see it literally like the John Birch Society. He saw it more as a kind of, you replace the word Jew with Illuminati and all this kind of stuff, didn't he? So he was more, in the UK we had the same thing with David Icke basically said the same thing here. He was like, it's not actually about the Jews or the Zionist movements and all this kind of thing. It's actually about reptiles in his case. Reptile, alien, But yeah. So it's done the rounds here as well, but in that kind of guise, as it's code for something else. But clearly, it's not. It's actually what it is.
Well, it isn't. I think at Cooper, what he's like, well, I don't know what he really thought. I mean, he occasionally get on the radio and rail against people like, anyhow, so that's more of a minor point. But I think that, his thing was that this is a forgery. This is one of the great forgeries in the history of this kind of mind control. And everybody knows that everybody hates Jews and they're the trouble with everything. But actually, they're just the scapegoats. And, these kind of documents are written by the real masters, who are just trying to deflect your attention away from themselves so they can continue to do all these horrible things and get it blamed on the Jews. So, being of the member of that particular tribe myself, I was willing to give him that, it didn't bother me. I'm not that kind of person, but, that's what got Bill Cooper on the enemies list of the Anti-Defamation League and stuff like that.
It's
that
the same thing that got David Icke on their list as well. It was he like I said, he, rather than seeing it as a piece of propaganda, he saw it as a piece of propaganda for alien reptiles.
It's right there. You can't beat the document. I mean,
yeah.
It's like, he was right about it. I mean, if you want to look at it, if you're going to write something like that, that would be those czar. Whoever really wrote it, those czarist policemen, whoever supposedly wrote it. They did a great job. So.
I like how Cooper attributes some of that to the quote Priory of Zion, which he's lifted from like Henry Lincoln's books, like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and stuff like that. And what's funny to me about that is that concept was also based on a forged document. So we have like layers of forged documents in this particular chapter of Behold the Pale.
For instance, like the Book of Revelations, which is probably the only book in the Bible that most people ever read.
The fun one.
That's been in and out of the Bible on numerous occasions, depending on who the Pope was. Some people kept it in, some people threw it out.
Yeah, they didn't. There was a lot of debate in the early centuries of Christianity about whether that should be in there at all.
It's not that different, I think. That kind of mentality is not that different.
Right. Yeah, they still debate it now.
I'm glad it's in there. It's great.
Yeah. It's the metal chapter.
You gotta have a good ending.
It's like good for the world. Who knows how many people have died because of that book? But but it's hey man, every hair in their head is numbered. Bob Dylan couldn't come up with that.
So we touched upon it earlier, but we should talk about the death of William Cooper, because it not only before we go into the death, we should talk about his kind of knack for prediction, because he kind of predicted his own death, but he also, one thing that with prediction that really interested me was he kind of predicted school shooters as well, didn't he? And the kind of link to sort of antidepressants and things like that.
There's no doubt about it. I was just looking at that today. Strangely enough, that people like the idea of you got to have this, that's another situation in which Cooper was really prescient, in the sense that he was able to anticipate the huge battle about the Second Amendment and guns in this country that goes on every day. Every time somebody kills 11 people in a shopping mall, you get this kind of anti-gun stuff. That's just the way it is. That's just par for the course. And there's already been what they call mass shootings. I don't know what the definition of a mass shooting, but I think there have already been 300. We're only in July. So this is symptomatic of a kind of society that might not necessarily be operating at the top of its game here. So But Cooper's idea, because being a Second Amendment dude, the idea is to try to come up with some other reason why people are acting insane, and it's got to be, and you got to blame it on somebody, I mean, the thing about Bill Cooper and go back to the Osama bin Laden thing is that when you're talking about predictions for conspiracy people, it's not really exactly what it seems like on the surface, because you're not really predicting what's going to happen. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you already know who did it. Them. The them did it. Whoever your them is or they, it's who they're going to blame it on. That's the prediction, Who's going to get the blame for this thing that these bad people are doing and continue to do? So that's why he was a brilliant guy at predicting Osama bin Laden was going to get the blame. Although it's not that strange, and you can see it coming after those different events that happened previously that were blamed on him. So which I don't know if he did it or not. So I do know that it was kind of weird to throw his body off the boat. That kind of plays into the whole thing. So in any event,
Cooper would have had a field day with that, wouldn't he? He would have had a field day with the boat thing.
Well, I mean, if you're supposedly the Obama administration and you're supposedly against this idea of people coming to what you consider to be the wrong conclusion, and disinformation and false news and all that kind of stuff, why would you drop that guy's body into the ocean? I mean, claim that that's what you did with it. I mean, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever for the reasons that they were supposedly, everybody's a complicit in these kind of things. It's a complicity that morons on the left are constantly blaming, people on the right, at least in this country. I don't even know what those terms mean anymore, for believing something that's stupid, but what am I supposed to think? Jeffrey Epstein commits suicide in prison, right? Well, what am I supposed to think? I mean, he probably did commit suicide in prison, but I mean, it's just like, and people do not understand the incompetency level of people in power, which is demonstrated on a daily basis, every single day, every minute, is never taken into consideration by the people who talk about these kind of like cause and effect things. It's like this because most people fuck up, and they, I don't know, whatever. So to go back to Cooper's death, do you want to hear this is, in my research, where I spent a lot of time doing this is what happened to Bill Cooper. Right?
Well, hold on. Let's talk about how did he get in trouble with the IRS first?
He didn't pay his taxes. He didn't pay his taxes. They get mad if you don't pay. I mean, it's as simple as that. And then he's got all these, and that's the big thing, right? 1913, a major year in right-wing thinking in this country, libertarian right-wing thinking. That's the year that the Federal Reserve is created, that somehow is being run by George Soros, even though he wasn't alive then. And that's the year that they create the Internal Revenue Service. And I think there's something else. Oh, Woodrow Wilson was another one of these kind of mystic figures for people and he's a miserable figure. I mean, one of the worst Americans of all times, actually, when you look at the real record. In any event, you got to go back to all this kind of stuff, and there's all this history of like that the Birch Society more or less dug up, and they put this into the canon about why things are not the way they want them to be. So Bill Cooper starts from there. And, one of the things that to show that you're a free person you're a free individual, as it says supposedly in the Constitution, that you're supposed to be, you know, this entity unto your own, is you're not going to pay taxes. You're not going to pay taxes. You're not going to finance whatever the government wants to do. I mean, I didn't want to pay my taxes because I didn't want to pay for B-52 bombers, you know. But I'm such a pussy that I did pay my taxes anyhow. So, but Cooper,
he's almost like he's almost
right?
like a sovereign
He's not
citizen
paying his taxes, you know. So, you know, I mean, it's just one of those things, you know, like you either pay and once you don't pay, and then you're on the radio. If there's one thing that the feds in this country do not like, is they don't want you. They don't like lawbreakers, and they certainly don't like people that thumb their noses at them. That is like, you know, I'm sure that's true everywhere. You know, so you know, so Bill Cooper's on the radio telling everybody who's listening to him not to pay their taxes. So he's got these problems, and then he sent a federal agent over to tell him that, like, you know, hey man, if you you're going to go to jail unless you pay your taxes. And he says, I'm not. That's my line in the sand. I'm not going to pay my taxes. So and he's got all these crazy, bogus kind of snake oil ideas about how you can get out of paying your taxes. I mean, the dumbest things in the world, like put the wrong address on it, you know, or, I mean, just really dumb shit. So like, and you know, so he's in trouble. So now he's got his, you know, you could go down to the post office and see Bill Cooper's thing on the wall. This is where in the U.S. they would, back in the day when people used to actually go to the post office, you could see the people who were like wanted by the FBI, federal criminals, you know, wanted for interstate flight, wanted for non-payment of taxes, and Bill Cooper could go in there and see his name on the wall in the post office. That verifies his paranoia. They are out to get me. They really are out to get me. So then he completely overreacts. You know, he's up there on top of this. I mean, the thing that's funny, if you listen to the broadcasts, it makes every successively the place where his house was, the hill gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, it's almost like he's living on top of Mount Everest. You know, I've been to his house numerous times. It's about 150 feet above the road. It's not that far up. You know, you do get a good view, but, you know, so he's under the impression that he's living in this kind of like rarefied world. And if you come up here with your warrants, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, you know, and nobody wants to get involved with him, because we're talking about, you got 1993, Waco, a disaster for the federal government, the real beginning of the right-wing conspiracy world and the legitimate hatred of the government by most right-thinking people, and not right in the sense, but, you know, they killed those people. There's no doubt about it. And for what? Because, I mean, they were definitely persecuted, but for their religion, because David Koresh was, regardless of all the other stuff that they said he did, I mean, he wasn't registered with the Baptist Church and he didn't pay his taxes. That's basically, he didn't pay by the game. So, and then you got Timothy McVeigh, you know, 2 years later on the very same day, April 19th, which is a big, huge day in this world. And so nobody wants to go up there and try to arrest Bill Cooper for not paying his taxes, because who wants to get in a gunfight with a lunatic? Because he's already telling you that he's going to shoot you if he comes up there. And you don't want to take a chance to find out if he's full of shit or not, because it's just not worth it. I mean, he didn't pay his taxes. Who cares? You know, it's like, you know, I mean, how much tax could he owe? He didn't make any money. It's not like it's like Mike Bloomberg is saying he doesn't want to pay his taxes. I mean, you know, right. Elon Musk doesn't want to pay his taxes. That's a problem, you know. So like,
but strangely, it wasn't his taxes that brought the county sheriff on that night.
Well, what happens is he gets more and more embattled, more and more paranoid, and he's under the impression that he owns that hill, that is his property, which is not the case at all. He owns one lot or two lots up there, and there's like 25 lots up there, most of which are vacant at the time or owned by somebody else. So it was a game. The people and the kids in the town used to drive up there and hang out waiting for Bill Cooper, the boogeyman, to come running out of his house and chase them away with his, screaming and waving his pistol. So, which is not that weird in America, because everybody has a gun. So, so in any event, the true story is that it's a Mormon town. Something like over 90% of the people who live in this town, Eager, Arizona, are members of the Latter-day Saints Church, which I'm sure, Raymond, you know all about, right? So, and they own most of the whole territory. So there's a guy named what was his name? Dr. Hamlin. Dr. Hamlin is related to a Mormon guy named Hamlin, who was considered to be the peacemaker to the Lamanites. The Lamanites, if you read the Book of Mormon, are the Indians, the darker skinned, darker hued people who are the people that own this territory. So when the Mormons wanted to set up their own territory, which was not going to have any dark people in it, they needed to make certain business deals with these hostile savages, or whoever they thought they were. And Mr. Hamlin went out there and he did the deal. He would trade them, make a deal with them, and allow our people to live here and don't attack them, and we'll give you X, Y, and Z. And it was like a quid pro quo kind of thing. So, and he became this famous person because of this. He's a revered elder of the church. So these people, Mr. Hamlin is his relative. I mean, it's hard to get bigger than that in that church. So he goes to medical school. He comes back. He grew up in this town, and now he's a married person with his young children, and he wants to go up to show them this place where he used to ride his bicycle back when he was a kid, which predated Bill Cooper owning this house, right? So he goes up there, and Bill Cooper comes running out with his gun, and not with his gun, actually. It's a longer story than that, but he comes out and chases him off because Cooper, in his mind, who's he's up there drinking Jack Daniels and all kinds of stuff like that, and he thinks that Hamlin is trespassing on his property. And Hamlin is a totally entitled person. I mean, who are you to tell me what to do? I am a big shot here, and I'm a doctor, and the whole town goes to me. I am a very important person, and who are you, you jerk off? So it's like a bad mix right there. It's a bad mix. So Cooper follows this. But the guy leaves because he's with his kids, and he doesn't want to get involved with this guy who he considers to be crazy, right? So they drive him down. He drives down the hill, and Cooper follows him in his pickup truck, and then pulls a gun on him on the guy's property. In other words, he's doing exactly what Cooper is mad about. You're coming on. Cooper is actually trespassing on this guy's property, and he's telling him never come up there again. So Mr. Hamlin doesn't take this well. He gets involved with all the police, and they won't do anything because they know it's not good to mess with Bill Cooper. They don't want to do it. And so Hamlin gets more and more mad, and eventually he gets involved with the Apache County Sheriff's Office, who was another jurisdictional kind of thing. And for years, they had this guy, Art Lee, I think his name was, who knew Bill Cooper personally, and it's an old boy kind of thing. And Cooper's just a crazy person in town. And everybody, a lot of people, all the cops are listening to him and agreeing with him. He's this big celebrity. And, but the new guy when Lee leaves, and another guy comes up there, this guy, Mr. Hanshaw, I think his name was. And he wants to prove what a tough guy is. So he's going to take out Bill Cooper. So they send like an army up there of these guys to arrest Cooper. And Cooper, who was previously been on the radio making his greatest single prediction, greater than the 9/11 one. He says one night they're going to come up here and shoot me dead on my front door step. My head is going to come to rest on my front doorstep, bleeding. And so they send these guys up there. Cooper, it's a long story about how it happened, but eventually they get into a gunfight. Cooper's armed, of course, and they shoot it out. And Cooper manages to shoot one of the cops in the head. He's never recovered, and they kill him and his head comes to rest on his doorstep, front doorstep, exactly as he said. And he even called the time. He said, at midnight, the time of death for Bill Cooper is 12:05 a.m. on the police report. So, what do you do if you're somebody who's trying to make sense of an American dilemma, this kind of crazy world that we're living in? How do you tell such a story with these kind of characters involved? You can either decide that you're going to be a Bill Cooperite and believe believe the Alex Jones narrative that they are out to get this truth seeker, and they went up there and the feds killed him, even though it's all on record, that wasn't the feds. The feds weren't even there. So, but it's a much better story. So, that's kind of what I was trying to do in that book. But not very many people were of the mindset that they wanted to read this. it's like you ever see that John Ford movie, Man Who Shot Liberty Valance?
Yeah.
It's got one of the greatest lines in the history of any modern society. When you're confronted with the truth or the legend, print the legend. John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, all these American iconic people are in this movie, and that is the thing that comes out of it. And it's definitely worth seeing it. So, I found it to be a sort of a fantastic episode in my little writing career. And, and I think Bill Cooper is, I still have a lot of respect for the guy. I really do. People think that I'm a CIA agent because I didn't believe everything he said, but, that's their problem, not mine. So,
What do you think?
I appreciate you printing, the facts and the legend both here. I think
you print the facts and the legend, it seems like to me,
Yeah. Why do you think, we talk about this a lot on the show, back in the 90s, we were talking about in Bill Cooper's heyday and the X-Files, all this kind of 90s up till about 9/11. What would you say? Why did the conspiracy theories go so dark, all of a sudden? Because before
people get dark, I think people just got dark.
Yeah,
it's a kind of look what's happened. You've got such a massive changeover. For instance, last night, you can see it everywhere. You understand what this woke thing is about because things have changed so quickly. We were looking last night. My son and my wife and I were sitting around looking for something to watch on TV, right? So I see this thing called Suits, which is a TV show that's been on. You know this, Jim? Mm-hmm. It actually has Meghan Markle. She's the star. Yeah. I go, is that her? I never watched this stuff, so I go, that's her, right?
Yeah,
so it was kind of funny. So in any event, the thing, you can tell it's not current. You can tell it's not current, and in fact, I looked it up. The thing went on TV for the first time in 2011, which is not exactly a ton of time ago. But there are all these things in the show. The heroes are these white guys who are scumbags, who are just out there trying to make as much money as possible. And you're you're kind of rooting them on. You hate them because, they're bad. But they really have a secret heart of gold, and all, and the way that women are treated in the thing. Every time a chick goes by, they have an extra little shot showing her ass walking by, and these are like the way it was. So now, fast forward to 12 years later, we were looking through the thing, going, well, they never would do that now. Never do that now. Never do that now. Never do that now. So, and they were like, it was only one episode. There must have been 15 of these episodes of these little things that would never happen now because of, whatever reason, the portrayal of black people, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying I'm for it, against it. I mean, it just is. And, those kind of things, that kind of reality slip, that kind of Martian, that Philip K. Dick Martian time slip between these things are real, So so people are feeling very skittish. They just don't know what to believe, And and one of the things hatred of experts is kind of interesting. That's one of the part of the mantra of don't trust those people that claim to be experts, right? Because they know too much. And so if you got someone's going to try to explain string theory to you, which may or may not be real. I mean, at what point do you preclude you not knowing anything about this and not having that kind of scientific mind? At what point do you tip out of that conversation? Pretty early on, I would say. I can't understand what you're talking about. So therefore, once you get to that point where you have no idea what this person's talking about, you have no assurance of whether or not he's telling you is true or not. So therefore, it even comes into that kind of thing where knowing more is not necessarily a good thing. You want to know what everybody else knows. The internet, God bless its little heart, is kind of part of that. When I was a journalist, when I was first becoming a journalist, the idea of the scoop, you're going to be the first person to have this thing. That was the goal, Now, you don't really want to go with a story until it's already out there. Because people are they've already been attuned to the fact that this is something they want to pay attention to, so they're going to read it. But if it's something that's totally alien to them, in other words, new, then they're just going to skip over it. And it's been proven by the click numbers. So why this is, I don't quite get it. I think that people's intense communication with the machine mind of the computer, which they spend 10 hours a day looking at, you're looking at a simulacrum of the human mind, yes and no, parts of it, parts not, parts of this, and your brain is evolving at the moment. So therefore your memories and it's just this William Gibson stuff, man. Which turns out to be true.
Yeah. That's what I say all the time. William Gibson, Baudrillard, they're all right. It's really
they're right, but they have a point.
Yeah.
It's happening, right? So therefore, when you can't be sure of what's going on around you, you're looking for some kind of shred of certainty that you can latch onto. And if David Icke is telling you that your mother is really a reptile, you go well, yeah, I could consider that. It's for instance, okay. Are you familiar with the movie called Invasion of the Body Snatchers?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a classic.
It's a classic, right? So at that point, when that movie came out in 1956, I happen to be a scholar of that film. So, because it's a good thing to know about, because it really states the problem in a lot of good ways. At that point, most people thought that the movie was about communism, because it was right in the middle of the Cold War. And they thought that what the commies did to right-thinking Americans who all have their independent mindset and, can think for themselves, was that they were going to brainwash you into thinking that then everybody became a socialist. So, and they looked the same and they talked the same, but they weren't the same. So now, since communism is like a dead issue, that's no longer an interpretation. But there's this kind of sense of like somebody else is programming you, you know? I mean, it's just, they should show that movie all the time and let people write their little essay about what they think it's about. You know? Because it changes. I mean, it's a solid story that requires different interpretation depending on when you're looking at it. So, you know, I don't know. So therefore, you know, people tend to fear the worst. You know, there's a lot of that in you. I mean, that's a human trait, I think. What's the worst that can happen? You know, and it seems like there's not enough self-confidence around to be able to fight that off. People feel they don't have any power. They're powerless. They're part of some gigantic machine. And The Matrix is, I'm not a big fan of that film. I don't think it's that good a film, but the significance of it is massive, I think. So
I think there's another element too, and that's pride. I think a lot of people, you were talking about Southerners and evangelicals earlier. I grew up in Georgia, and I think a lot of it's just pride. You don't like that there's anybody smarter than you. You don't want to admit that. You don't want to admit that somebody.
I agree with you totally.
Something.
I mean, who wants somebody talking down to you? I mean, fuck that. I mean, you know.
Exactly. And the problem is I think people assume they're being talked down to, like you were saying, just because they've gotten further along in the conversation about string theory than they know the vocabulary for anymore.
Yeah, so instead
of being curious.
Who are you? More about string theory, which doesn't matter in the scope of the universe anyhow.
Well, there you go. For your average American, you're right about that. That's for sure.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with you completely. I mean, you know, there's a lot of, when you're talking about why thoughts get dark, you know, I think that's definitely part of it. You know, I don't know. I mean, I'm just happy to stay here in my little zone over here in New York City, you know, where I kind of understand. To me, it's a small town. I know the place. I grew up here. You know, anytime I feel like I'm getting a little bit depressed, I go over to Queens, where, you know, there's we're at school has 35 different languages spoken in one classroom, you know, and I feel like, you know, okay, cool, I'm a human being. You know, I'm part of this team, you know, so you know, I'm not really necessarily part of any other team, you know, I'm just part of this team, and I feel happy about that. It was like a gift that my parents gave me by having me and growing up in Queens. And, you know, there's a lot of traffic and, you know, people are annoying and they don't have very good manners, but, you know,
but there's still a romance to it, especially from people that aren't from that part of the country. I think a lot of us are interested in your New York stories.
I go down to Georgia. I have a great time down there. I mean, I love the people down there. You know, I think it's kind of an interesting place right now, isn't it?
Yeah. Interesting enough that I got out.
So. You know, it's that business. I mean, at least from the outside, you know, I'm not pretending to know what's going on, you know, because I'm not from there or know that much about it, spend that much time there. But the idea that like now you're beginning to get like these different narratives out of there, like when you got a city like Atlanta, which is mostly black and full of like these accomplished people, you know, it just becomes a different kind of place. And I think that's a really kind of fascinating place. I wouldn't mind living there right now.
It is. It's quickly butting up against the old power structure. And that conflict is getting, the score is getting much more even between those two groups. I'm not talking about African Americans so much, just modern people versus the old white county seat elite, I guess, more than anything. And the tension is palpable there, especially outside. Yeah,
well, palpable tension tends to be interesting, you know. I mean, it may not be healthy. I mean, I used to be a reporter in South Africa, right? You know, I spent a lot of time during apartheid down there, doing magazine stories and stuff like that. So, like, I would go to these art shows, student art shows at Witwatersrand. What's the name of that? Is it Witwatersrand University? It was a university in Johannesburg. It was the most interesting art produced by college students I ever saw, because they had something to think about. They were in this place that was actually things were changing. You had to stay on top of it. You had to use your brain to survive there one way or another. If you were white or black, it didn't make a difference. If you're in this intellectual community, it wasn't the standard. You can adhere to standard positions, like this is what I think, this is the kind of person I am. Or you can like just throw yourself into the stream and listen to all these different voices, which I'm not saying I'm that successful about it, but that's my goal all the time, to listen to what everybody says, and then, decide who's crazy, for myself, would I not necessarily mention it. But it's just, and I think the world is very interesting now. It's just a kind of fascinating place to be because of all these weird changes that are going on, and the tech war is, it's fascinating. We have this guy, Douglas Rushkoff. We do this.
Yeah, he's been on our show several times.
Oh,
he's been on my show too.
Yeah.
I know the guy. So, we have this thing that we do in the Lower East Side called the Meeting of the Minds. It's called MOM. I'll send you an invitation sometime. And we have these, thinkers. so Douglas is a thinker, right? So we had him on, and we wanted to, well, Douglas, you're the guy. I mean, tell us about AI. Should we be afraid of it or not? And he said, he didn't really have his rap completely settled on this one. He said, there's no such thing as AI. I said, really? He was very entertaining. It's cool.
Well, Rushkoff's interesting. He's part of the, he was sort of part of the counterculture back in the day, the sort of 90s counterculture and the early internet counterculture, and friends with Timothy Leary and people like that. So he's got a good kind of background to sort of,
he was part of the idea that that kind of utopian idea about what the computer was going to do for the human species. And now he's completely on the other side. He's totally, he just wrote this book about these enemies of the people, or like owning these internet companies, so I think it's called The Survival of the Richest or something like that, So
it's weird that he didn't see that coming with the work he did on like Merchants of Cool and that PBS special he did back, what was it, in 99? No, it was 2001, where they were talking about media consolidation. And I think it's interesting that that none of us really foresaw that they were going to consolidate the internet just in the same way that they had done.
Well, I mean, it just makes you feel stupid now because nobody recognized it. They just thought that well, here's this new thing. But having lived through the hippie movement, where everybody was, was going to be great. The world was going to be a wonderful place. It just didn't turn out that way, right? So you're already kind of wary, well, I don't know, what about this, So, but Rushkoff is an interesting figure because of that, and he's always entertaining to listen to. So,
anyway,
it was fun.
Thank you so much for giving us, some of your time. I really appreciate it. If people want to find you online, what's the best place?
Well, I have this Instagram account. Unfortunately, I don't have my website thing, which I'm working on set up yet. But the Instagram account is Pale Horse Rider Book on Instagram, and that's it's just an Instagram account that on Bill Cooper's birthday and on his death day, we do Cooper Week. The other stuff is more general.
Oh, okay.
But, it seems that's got about 2,000 followers or something like that. So, it's not big, but they're all organic, as they say. so.
And we're back. So how do you feel the episode went, Mr. Wiley?
God, it was like talking to my boomer parents, but cooler.
Yeah.
Because this guy's seen so many things and done so many things. So how about that American Gangster?
Yeah, I know.
Right? Like you bring a guy on to talk about the conspiracy theorist. Oh wait, he may have inspired this Ridley Scott movie. Yeah. As well. I thought that was pretty cool too,
and was responsible for the TV series Taxi, which I've seen a few episodes of as well, which is kind of cool. I didn't know that actually. That was kind of interesting. But I mean, he's got a really interesting take on William Cooper. He clearly admires him, which is something interesting. 'Cause I think a lot of writers wouldn't be as brave enough to say that, would they, in this day and age? But he clearly admires him. He clearly, there's a fondness there, even though this guy had some questionable, not Mark Jacobson, William Cooper had some questionable beliefs.
Oh yeah, he's not a very 21st century kind of guy, that's for sure. And definitely of a type that may not be very popular these days because of certain political movements going on throughout the West. So
yeah, possibly, but I don't know. I still think what he's had to say is quite, it's still valuable. I think his insights are.
Oh yeah. And he's romantic. There's a certain romance about the story of someone becoming this sort of indie broadcasting star. So, and there's of course my dog, in time
making
for
an
our
appearance.
recording. So.
Yeah. That's all good. So, if people want to find you online these days, I hear you're going video as well.
Yes, we're coming back for a second season of Retrophilia in the coming months. So if you're interested in the 1990s and that whole period in time, and that cultural milieu, kind of like what we were talking about today, check that out. It'll just be on YouTube. So just search for like Retrophilia podcast on YouTube. And once it's up, you can watch. And we'll be doing live streams too. So if you like live video, come in the chat sometime, and we'd love to talk to you.
And so you did one episode about the occult in the 90s, didn't you? So for our listeners, they'll get a
new age 90s. A sort of it's sort of like listening to Pure Moods for an hour, except it's me and Audra talking.
Okay, excellent. Well, it sounds like your dog is wanting you for something, so we'll let you go. But if you want to find Sitting Now, we're at Sitting Now everywhere, except we've got a TikTok account now, which I still feel very old manly saying that. I don't know. That seems to be what the kids use. I don't feel like I should be there, but we put one video up there so far, and it's done all right. Not in TikTok terms, but if you want to find us on TikTok, we're at Sitting Now Official. But we're at Sitting Now everywhere else. And do drop a comment or a like, subscribe if you like this video, and send us some some comments, good or bad. I like interacting with people. So yeah. Anyway, I'm waffling a bit now, so I will see you next week.
Bye now.